RJ, I've been following your work now. I was trying to figure it out for several years. I can't remember where we met, but I've been watching your work and I've been watching it grow.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that, like a lot of artists, your your work grows organically. That you start a project, you finish it, and it takes you to the next project. And I've appreciated watching that. So I wonder if you could maybe walk us through your career a little bit and talk about the various projects that you've done since you launched a career as a fine art photographer
I'll give the short abbreviated version for the sake of the
without the
Zoom.
blood, sweat, and tears.
That's right, right. I had a wonderful experience in the high school darkroom learning photography, and I knew this was a direction I wanted to take in my career. I also knew that there wasn't much money to support myself in that venture, and so I was embraced liberal arts education and studied environmental geography and art history. So kind of a double major as an undergrad at Colgate University. And I started an internship that would really sway the entire course of my career at National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C. And I was eventually, after my internship was over, I was hired as a contractor and I did a lot of writing and reporting. And that eventually led to a full staff position where I was a cartographer. So I made maps for National Geographic. And I was inspired by some of the best photographers in the world for photojournalism, nature photography, and that sort of thing. And I had a mentor of mine. He really encouraged me to find my shtick. You know, it was really important that you are the subject matter expert in what you choose to photograph. And, you know, I had been exposed to the work of, world-class oceanography photographers like David Dubélé. And I'm like, or those like Chris Rainier that photograph vanishing cultures. And it's like, I'm not interested in the exotic. There are people that do it far better than I ever could. However, I am interested in slowing down and finding beauty in the ordinary and in the common. And I kind of continued my photography pursuits. I studied geography at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I was really interested in kind of these how people shape place and how place shapes people. So the kind of fundamental human geography, nature society relationships I was interested in exploring. And I started, it's kind of a back burner business, plan B, if you will. If I ever were laid off or whatnot, I started my photography business, my commercial business. And I began photographing portraits of, couples. Weddings were something I was very interested in. And it was really it proved to be a cornerstone in shaping, how I use light as well, because oftentimes I'm thrown into many situations and, how to creatively make lemonade out of lemons, if you will. And if we look at that word photography, it's writing with light. And so knowing that I can schlep that light on the airplane and create work that I was proud of. And I was in Ireland in 2012 photographing a wedding, and I brought my field equipment, my lighting equipment, out into the field and photographed Quigley, which is my mother's maiden name, and it's an area in Ireland where my mom's family is from. And you look at the landscape and this is it looks like a golf course, right? Been preened by sheep and goats for hundreds of years. And I was interested in seeing, these are people that have emigrated, from Ireland to the United States. It's part of my heritage. And these animals were very mythical, right? We read about them in the Bible, like the sacrificial lamb, yet they're sports mascots at the same time. And last year we had the LA Rams won the Super Bowl, right? So my work isn't necessarily about sports or about biblical scripture, but it's these relationships that humans have had over time with animals. And according to National Geographic, goats are the oldest domesticated species. So humans have almost co-evolved with goats long before dogs and cats. And we've relied on them for companionship, of course, fiber, for wool, textiles, milk, cheese, meat, and so on. And so they've heavily shaped us and where we could live and how we could survive. And I was interested to see how, just with breeding at fairs and contests, how we've shaped them, right? And how this animal from 500 years ago, what it has become today, right, as a utilitarian creature.
So you started photographing romantic and beautiful domestic animals, goats, in a romantic and beautiful landscape. And those photographs are lit like fashion photographs. I've always loved that.
Thank you.
But then you made this really significant transition, I think, to photographing children and the animals they cared for. I'm not using the word own because I don't think that's quite appropriate. But what took you there? Was it simply going back from Ireland to Minneapolis and discovering that there was this subject there for you?
Sure. As I thought a lot about what I wanted my work to become, and I knew I did not want to be constantly getting on an airplane, flying across an ocean in order to create work. My wife works, and so there needed to be someone more closer on the domestic side to help with raising children. We have 2 children. And so I started looking closer to home. Is how can I find these subjects, these animals that I was interested in photographing without having to fly to Norway, Iceland, Germany, so on, right? And so many of these paintings that are in my head that I've been inspired by, whether it be Beardstad or Thomas Sidney Cooper, have the animals in the landscape. So what I found is I'm like, if I went to county fairs here in Minnesota, which Minnesota has a lot of these agricultural contests, which are rooted in pride and tradition. Who's got the best champion animal for the ribbon, and the same pickles or rodeo contests, that sort of thing, is a showcase. It's a stage there, and I wasn't necessarily interested in just the winner, the supreme champion per se. But then I said, well, wouldn't it be interesting to photograph the kids who did not win, because they still have worked hard. And using that is a way to get to know more, agricultural families that raise these animals. So I used it as kind of like a stepping stone, if you will.
Tell us how you did it. Did you just wander around the fair with a lot of lights and a backdrop and approach teary children who had just lost moments after this really critical moment and just say, you stand there, I'm going to take your picture?
Sure. It started with a grant, as many kind of projects start, is articulating and thinking about what it is that I wanted to do. And I was successful in receiving a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board. And so that gives you this extra sense of confidence, like I'm on a project and I'm focused. And so I knew fairly specifically what I wanted to do. So I had my gear cart I would bring to the county fair. And it's a very hot and dusty and smelly and loud environment, but I was used to that. I knew that was to be expected. And I would, bring my equipment. I had a backdrop that was painted is by a fashion photographer, what they would use, all right, on set for like Vanity Fair. So I had all this gear, tools with me, and I would go to where the animals were being judged through the 4-H. And 4-H is kind of a youth development program here in the United States. It's backed by the United States Department of Agriculture, and it's really there to foster the life skills of youth through raising and showing animals. But there's other activities within 4-H, and it's very community focused. working on attitude, public speaking, the elements of hard work, that sort of thing. That's what they're really there for. And so I would go to these contests, and the animal judge, there would be you'd be in a ring, with there would be bleachers there, and families and friends would be watching, and there's a microphone, and the judge would work through their knowledge of the anatomy of the animals and what the butchers would want. For example, if it's a meat animal to be sold off for meat production, they would have all this history and theory in their head, and they would articulate their thoughts on the structure of the animal and this sort of thing. And so he would start pulling the winners off to the side, and he would literally line them up, right? From the grand champion, second, third, fourth, all the way down. So I would go up to those that were standing right in the end of the line at the end of the judging. Their emotions were quite raw. I would introduce myself, tell them a little bit about what I'm working on, and get parent permission, but promise to put them in the best light possible. I wasn't there to make fun of them, and they had no idea who I was. And I say I'm a city slicker through and through. Like, I did not raise a farm or grow up on a farm or have farm animals, but I respect what you do. And they trusted me. And so I created a series of portraits of 65 youth in 2016. And this was across 10 different counties in my state.
And ranging in age from what, 7 or 8?
From 4 to the oldest they can go is 18 and 19. They can compete 1 year after they graduate from high school. Okay, so 12th grade, and then that's the cutoff. And there are various different entries. Some focus on raising rabbits, some are chickens, some are pigs, the swine. And I really wanted to showcase the relationship between the youth, the handler, and the animal. And just given the visual proportions, a bunny, it's not quite the same, and a chicken, they're quite small, right, to hold and whatnot. But a sizable animal that would give some physical gruffness to holding it and positioning it. I wanted to see what that looked like, and especially in proportion to the height of the youth handler, right? Some kids, their animals were almost taller than them, and others, they were able to, really almost like hold them right in place, kind of like a bodybuilder holds a pose for judging contests. And so that's where it all began. And I, no one paid me to do this project. This was just something that I wanted to see, and it gave me an opportunity to experiment with light and my painterly light aesthetic that I'm just wanted to see what would this look like.
And that project, we have to recognize, has been wildly successful. It's resulted in a book and multiple exhibitions. And I think many people might have argued that you found a winner, so stop. But you didn't stop. And in fact, the project that follows, The Unchosen Ones, is actually taking a step back in many cases from animals, and is focusing more on the young people themselves. Can you talk about how you conceptualize that project?
Sure. As a parent, I see my own children grow, and it's hard to see on a daily basis, a weekly basis, but year to year, there's distinct change. And I was interested to see, well, what would that change be for these kids? What was that resilience, that growth from defeat? What did it look like? And so this was 4 years later. I chose to reconnect with the youth. Again, this was a grant-supported project. So I had it in my head when I was writing the grant that the county fairs would be still going on in Minnesota, not knowing that COVID would completely lock down all county state fairs in Minnesota, and mostly in all of the US. And I was determined, though, to continue the project, and I did not know what it would look like, but I knew these kids were still working with their animals, because I've kept in touch with them over the years. And the animals, you can't, it's just not like a library book that you can just put on a shelf and then it, it's going to be there when you come back in 2 years. But the animals had to be fed daily and groomed and cared after. And so one by one, I reached out to one of the youth and just say, hey, what are you into? What's your thing now? Because kids' habits change and their interests change. And this to me was interested because it gave me an opportunity to see, hey, in rural America, what is changing, and what does remain the same, and what does that look like? And it was really fascinating. The kids were very responsive. They would get back right away, and we'd set up a time to meet. Now, keep in mind the county fairs were canceled, so I had to travel to them, and that's what created almost 4 months of work driving around the state, making appointments, and and many of them would be like, oh, I'm going fishing today. I can't do it. Can you do it tomorrow? And so, that's how kids are, right? But most of them, I was able to re-photograph 50 out of the 65. Some had moved out of state. Some just, I didn't have their contact information. They had changed or whatnot. But, in the next series of portraits, I asked them, show me your best self, right? And so I really asked them to think about how they want to be portrayed.
So it was much more of a collaboration than either of the earlier projects.
Yes, much more. They got to choose where we met, what we would do, what they would be wearing. I did not control it at all. I was just there. The one thing, though, I was careful of is I knew I wanted to interview them after. And I needed a quiet space. Sometimes if you're outside and you're trying to interview people, there's the wind, there's construction, road noise, there's animal noises. And so often I would choose a quieter spot on the farm, sometimes even in a barn that the doors are open. And then after our portrait session, I would, brought the same backdrop there, and some kids had different animals that they were really passionate about still working with, and some kids still had the exact same animal 4 years later. So it was almost like reuniting with an Oscar winner, like, oh my god. It was very fun. And you could see that kind of change over time. The kids, of course, all got taller and more mature over a 4-year period. But they realized, like, no, this was really a fun little project that they were proud to be a part of then and going forward. So then I created the photograph, brought same lighting, same backdrop. But then this time I set up a microphone on them and a little video recorder on a tripod. And I asked them some questions. And I knew that their messages and the lessons that they've learned and the advice that they would give to other competitors were important. I knew that. But just putting it in writing, when you hear, try to read what an 8-year-old has written, it's not as endearing as you hear it in their own voices and the nervous energy or their enthusiasm. So that's why I needed to kind of hear their voices and see them saying. So video made sense for that project. And I did not know at the time what I was going to do with that footage, but I'm like, okay, it's there, right? I got it. So that was basically the summer of 2020. I looked at reconnecting with many of the youth is almost a silver lining to lockdown for COVID, because the kids I found were spending a lot more time outside, right, caring for their animals. These are very rural areas, in nature, right, away from their computers, which is, I think, something we could all probably benefit from. And there's a lot of research that's showing how anxiety and depression, especially 3rd, 4th graders, as an impact of too much screen time, right? And I looked at this as kind of a silver lining that the kids could spend more time with their animals. And, but then George Floyd was murdered, 2 kilometers from my house. And I had to address that head on. and of course the riots that were going on at the same time, and this just the racial discrimination that's prevalent in the country. And what did these white kids think, and these rural kids think of what was going on in the closest city to them that had global shockwaves that set off all sorts of political protests and violence. And it was a tough time for our country. And so it was interesting hearing what from their own voices, that perspective. And those videos are on my little website in a separate section as well.
Well, when we started this conversation, one of the things you said that struck me was that I have no interest in the exotic, right? You want to sort of work close to home, perhaps with a culture that you know, even if it's not exactly yours. I mean, I think the rural-urban divide may not be as significant as the generational divide. You will never be 17 again. And so you're explicating some of that culture as well. But as I watch the trajectory of your work, of your career, I can't help but think that moving this work, which let's acknowledge, it's about white kids in a rural situation. The photographs could be read as romantic. They are part of the kind of myth of the United States, that even though most people are not white and rural in the United States, we still see that as being sort of perhaps a truer version of America. But now your work is being seen in Europe by people who have much less exposure to that American myth and to that whole way of life. I mean, you have to explain what is 4-H, what is a county fair. And I'm just curious about sort of whose exotic are we talking about? These people may not be exotic to you. And I'm just curious about the way, whether you have perceived a difference in the way your work is perceived in Europe as opposed to how it's seen in the United States.
Sure. Well, I identify as almost an outsider to this project, given that I did not grow up on a farm. I'm a city slicker through and through. Yes, I know where milk comes from and wool and cheese, but there are so many other kids in the city that think wool grows on a tree, right? Even though it's in their own area, right? And so I was interested in, the animal husbandry aspect of working on a farm. And there's this notion of the ideal, like, oh, life would just be so easy if I just had a hobby farm and we moved out of the city and we had animals. And then that was slowly unraveled as I realized, like, many of these people can't take a vacation because they can't leave their animals. So they're constantly chained to taking care of their animals, which they love, right?
Well, but obviously farming and caring for animals and children caring for animals on a family farm, that's not unique to the American Midwest. That happens all over the world. And in fact, it probably happens more in places outside the United States. But I'm curious as to whether you're finding that people understand your work because of some kind of universality, or are they appreciating it for its specific detail about a kind of exotic group? And I guess I'd also like to hear how you respond to people perceiving the work as romantic. Do you think the work is romantic? Is it unrealistic? Is it mythic?
I don't think so. I mean, it's real. It's raw. Yes, there's idyllic romantic notions in visual imagery of, perfectly lit objects like a still life or animals that were painted in with detail. I do think there's a timelessness that it is when you try to date the photographs, they could have been taken in the 1960s. They could have been taken in the 1990s. And so there is some trends. It's like these are almost a time capsule right? And then you can romanticize
Well,
about the
I'm
yesteryear.
struck by how there's this intriguing tension and disconnect between the subject of the photographs and the look of the photographs. And
Mhm,
that's a very specific technical thing that you've
mhm,
chosen to do. We
mhm,
see things like county fairs and rodeos photographed all the time, but
mhm,
not with lighting that makes the animals look like Vogue models.
mhm,
And
mhm.
I'm curious about that disconnect. Um,
Sure, sure,
so, I mean, talk a little bit about your sort of stylistic intentions.
sure.
Why
It
did you
was
make it look the way it does?
right. Well, this draws on, I mean, my 10 years as a commercial photographer, as a wedding photographer, creating photographs of a bride on her wedding day. And they have to look and feel beautiful and special because this is their day, right? So this is my own kind of experiences drawn from my photography background and commercial business into my fine art work, where I have these commercial tools, right? All the lighting equipment and C-stands and knowledge cameras that can create this stylized look. And I wanted to create something that you know a lot of painters, you see a lot of different work at a fair, and their work is all very different because they all use they paint the light in differently or the different colors used. But in photography, especially with typology, there's a lot of sameness. And so I wanted to really distinguish my artistic palette from other photographers. And so that's through lighting and paying close attention, for example, to the color of the highlight, the main light, the warmth of that color versus the coolness in the shadows, the softness of the shadows. And I joke, one of my little technical tricks is I hide my main light with my fill light. It's a very, simplistic way of making it look like it was not lit by artificial lighting, right? But there is some extra zhuzh and oomph there to make it have that romanticism, like a stylized, like something that would look like they would be on the cover of Vanity
It,
Fair magazine.
your subjects are separated from their environment by the light and the backdrop.
Mhm,
And I think that does lend to more creating of a typology.
mhm,
But
mhm.
I'm intrigued by this transition from a, a skill demanding commercial practice. I don't know, but I would think that shooting weddings is probably some of the most difficult clients you're ever going to get. You might have been quite relieved to look at pigs and chickens after looking at brides and grooms for a while and mothers-in-law. But I'm fascinated by the way you are sort of institutionalizing this experience, that in addition to all of your work as a photographer, you're also mentoring young photographers now, and you're developing a curriculum for moving from a commercial practice to a fine art practice. And so I'm curious about the mentoring. I'd like to hear more about that.
Sure. Yes.
But I'm also just intrigued by the way you are managing your career. You're
Sure.
producing books, you're producing videos. You've really successfully made this transition.
Thank you. Well, I treat my photography fine art work as a business. It's I want to support myself for the long term to have this kind of sustainable creative practice. I feel like I owe it to myself to have a sustainable practice. All too often, I see burnout in my photography wedding colleagues, that it's just so much time in front of the computer, and they look at the camera and it looks like work to them. They don't even want to pick up the camera. And I knew I did not want to do that. So that's one of the reasons I kind of transitioned from, focusing on commercial work more into fine art work for long longevity, right? To avoid burnout. Mark Twain once said, never let school interfere with your education. And so much of my learning, whether it be lighting or business acumen, my approach in the book arts, or learning how to do professional sound and video recording, has all been kind of learning on my own, right? With going to workshops, not necessarily going the traditional MFA track, right? To learn how to, the art and museum world's approach often to art. I was coming at it from more of a practical, commercial perspective. And so, but there was no secrets. As I was learning, people were able to share, whether there's a website called Strobist by David Hobby that gives all sorts of really wonderful tips and tricks on lighting, and people like Greg Heisler, who's got more Time Life magazine covers than anyone else. He's very generous with his time and very enthusiastic. And I was like a sponge and learned so much from that. And I felt like, a rising tide raises all ships. And so if I can give back and help others, like it forms community and helps others. In my wedding photography business, I found that was actually one of the benefits is you would create a referral network by me helping you. Oh, your book, you'll refer something to me. And it's very indirect. You never ask for that, right? But in the fine art realm, we're all in these little bubbles working on our own projects. And it's nice when you're at a stumbling block. How do I, edit this differently? Or how do I print this? Or resolve some technical issue? Or trying to think broader about a project? Those, I feel like, with having mentorships and sharing, I learn just as much as I try to impart upon my other mentees, if you will. And as I'm turning 44 soon, next week, and and so you start thinking about your own legacy and how do you want to be remembered, and what impact on the world do I want to leave? And if I was to hold all my secrets in, that to me would work against what I want to be known for, and I want to help others. So I found great joy in that. And there's some 4 hours of recorded content that is on my website under a new EDU series. And I've really enjoyed kind of using those as that content as a springboard for just more one-on-one mentoring in person or on Zoom. And that's been fun.
And I think really the obvious next question is, what comes next for you? I mean, you've got several solid bodies of work. You're exhibiting in the United States, but also in Europe. Your work is held now in museum collections. You have gallery representation. You've done a book. You've done a limited edition portfolio. You've won all sorts of prizes for the work that you've done. And I'm curious, and we see that your work connects organically. And so I wonder what the next project is. Sure. And whether it will involve media other than still photographs.
Sure. I love the interdisciplinary, and getting my hands dirty and working more with my hands is really important. I think sitting in front of the computer too long makes us stale. So dabbling more in the book arts is something that I'm interested in. I'm working on a custom deluxe edition portfolio that will be debuted at my solo exhibition opening May 21st of 2020 at my gallery, Burnett Fine Art and Advisory in Minnesota. And that will feature an accordion fold-out book, in addition to a custom wrapped version of this is the actual book here, but there's a denim cloth version. Many of the kids are wearing denim, so that seemed to make sense, as well as the accordion will have links to video documentaries that I produced of the kids, of interviews. I worked with a producer for those, and to make sure they're short snippet, 3-minute vignettes, warm, humorous. So that'll debut next month. As for this summer, I am bringing this 1900 camera. It's a Kodak 8x10 view camera out in the field, back out to many of the new county fairs that I haven't been to. And I'm gonna see what I create tintypes wise, given portraiture and this notion of family, and what does that look like?
Why? I
Multi-generation
mean,
families.
I completely understand that a lot of photographers are kind of gearheads,
Mhm,
and they really like playing around with various media, but
mhm.
tintypes, I wonder, I mean, tintypes are now essentially sort of a romantic medium for portraiture
Mhm,
because they evoke times 100 years ago,
mhm,
and they have a look that's
mhm.
unlike anything else, and they're
Correct.
hard to do.
Right.
So why tintypes when you've
Sure.
established yourself as a master of lighting, as a really good colorist, and
Mhm.
now you're making these sort of strange brown things? Talk to me about that.
Sure, sure. Well, if we look at the history of photography, it was born the same time as the history of animal contests. And so that's one of the reasons we see some of the very first photographs are of prize-winning animals, or at least of horses and cattle, whether it be Nadar and Adrian Tournejean. And if we look at the first exhibition of photography in 1851, and it's at the World's Fair in London, and we contrast that with the very first kind of animal contest would be the New York State Fair, which was held a year prior in 1850. So both have been heavily influenced by technology. Of course, the wet plate collodion process is what they would have used to create the glass plate negatives for which they would have created their salt prints from, right? Um, Carrying glass in the field is somewhat problematic in the sense that they're prone to all sorts of breakage and this sort of thing. So I like this
Heavy.
notion. They're heavy and yes, but they're beautiful. There's a twinge of nostalgia that comes with that, and especially when you think of future agriculture farmers in America, what does that look like? Where are we going with impacts of global climate change and sustainability? It does make us think a little bit more about our current, what are we using? Where are we getting our food from? And so using kind of a historical tool, I think will help introduce a little bit more messiness in my
Mhm.
projects and my work. Um, and people were also very curious about, just as I was very curious on what this baby goat is and looks like, and I've never seen a baby goat before, they're going to come up to this old camera with no batteries in it, and they'll be probably equally as interested. And sharing the history of photography with them, I think, is going to be a nice little gateway to begin something bigger.
And in fact, we don't know where it will go. That's one of the
Correct.
fun things about the way you work. Now, when I get to know a photographer, I usually start with their work, and I see a lot more of the work before I begin to know the personhood of the maker of the work. But I almost always discover some slightly surprising sort of personal quirk or inclination in the photographer that may be the key element that explains the work to me.
Sure.
And after I got to know you a little bit, I discovered that you're a long time, very serious practitioner of martial arts. And is there a connection? Did you learn something in martial arts that has contributed to your success as a photographer, or vice versa?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I feel like as a martial artist, you're a student of life. You're constantly learning. And one of the questions I asked my black belts at their black belt testing to reveal to me is the difference between an athlete and a martial artist, right? Athletes compete at the Olympics, often they're team sports, but a martial artist is a deeply internal thing that you're always reconciling with oneself, improving yourself. Like you're always trying to make yourself better, right? To improve in flexibility, agility, speed, and yet there's a gracefulness, there's an art form. Yet it's also, if you had to defend yourself, it is highly street practical at the same time. So I like this kind of yin and the yang between the functional and the beautiful. If you ever seen martial artists perform, it looks like a dance. They're elegant. I mean, the gymnastic ability and jumping ability is astounding me. But there's also a set of when you're sparring, for example, and it's much like kickboxing, or it's an Olympic sport. There is a sense of movement, of awareness that you are hyper vigilant of, because someone can do a spin round kick right to your head, and if you didn't see it coming, you're going to be laying flat on the ground. And so when I'm photographing, your peripheral has to expand, so that if you see something on the horizon that could be of interest, that you need to kind of follow that gut instinct. So I say there is certainly a lot of that skill set involved. As it relates to my interaction with the kids, when you're a 5th degree black belt and you're trying to impress upon kids the importance of listening, paying attention, and following directions, these things that parents love to instill in their youth, right? As a black belt, you have this responsibility, like you're a marked man, like, or marked woman, or a marked person, like they're watching every single thing you do, right? As a leader, and they will listen. And so with my 4-H youth, I found it's a very much of a similar relationship where, there's a mutual level of respect that goes a long way, and a lot of learning as well.
So that's actually really helpful, because you're describing both your photographic practice and your martial arts practice as being a way of looking, a way of being in the world, but also I love that it's a way to make something that is both functional and beautiful, which certainly sums up the work. There's so much information in these photographs, and now that you're adding the videos and the interviews, there's even more information. It's really a way of telling a story, and at the same time, despite their informational qualities, the work is sort of evocative and oddly dreamy for something this precise. I'm looking forward to seeing what a messier version of your work looks like. And I mean, I know it's a very busy spring for you. You've got multiple openings and ongoing work. So I wish you all success with those, and I'm so happy that we have this audience for this conversation to introduce people to your work, and for them to join me in continuing to follow your work, which I fully intend to do. So thanks for sharing this. I feel like I know a lot more about what you're up to, and I'm glad of that.
Good. Well, I appreciate your kind words, and we're lucky that photographers have these things called portfolio reviews, where we can get feedback and build the people on our inner circle that we can kind of confide in and bounce ideas off of and be inspired, but also like tell us like this is not the right direction sometimes, right? And so I appreciate the kind words and your mentorship over the years, and this has been fun.
We have a good photographic community here, and in a funny way, the fact that we're all kind of living on Zoom these days makes that community even bigger, even more universal, even more possible. So hello, photo community. Thanks for listening.